Hey there, weary traveller. Tonight, we're stepping away from the comfort of modern life and wandering back through time to a world of stone walls, flickering torches, and the kind of living conditions that would make even the most dedicated camping enthusiast pack up and head straight home. We're exploring why you wouldn't survive in a medieval castle. And trust me, it's not just because you'd miss your morning coffee. If this kind of historical storytelling helps you drift off to sleep, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all settling into the same quiet stories together, scattered across time zones, but united in our curiosity about the past. So dim the lights, maybe pull that blanket a little closer, and let's walk together through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval castle. Because what awaits inside isn't the romantic fairy tale you might imagine, but something far more challenging, far more brutal, and infinitely more fascinating than any movie could capture. Picture this. You wake up in your own bed this morning, reach for your phone to check the time, stumble to the bathroom where clean water flows at the twist of a handle, and within minutes you're standing under a hot shower. You grab clothes from a closet full of options, each piece soft, clean, and perfectly sized. Breakfast might be whatever strikes your fancy, prepared in a kitchen where food stays fresh for weeks, cooked on appliances that respond to the touch of a button. By the time you're fully awake, you've already experienced more comfort and convenience than most medieval castle dwellers would see in a lifetime. Now, let's rewind about 800 years and drop you into the same morning routine, but this time within the thick stone walls of a medieval fortress. The contrast isn't just dramatic, it's genuinely shocking, because what we think of as basic human needs, things like warmth, cleanliness, privacy, and safety, were luxuries that even the wealthy could barely achieve. And if you weren't wealthy, if you were just a servant or a guard or anyone without noble blood, well, surviving a single week would be an accomplishment worth celebrating. The first thing that would hit you, literally, is the cold. Not the kind of cold where you turn up the thermostat or throw on an extra sweater. This is bone-deep, relentless, inescapable cold that seeps through stone walls and settles into your very soul. Medieval castles weren't built for comfort. They were built for defense, which means thick walls, narrow windows, and absolutely no consideration for things like insulation or central heating. Your bedroom, if you're lucky enough to have one, would be a small stone chamber with walls that weep moisture in the winter. The floor might be covered with rushes, basically dried grass and herbs scattered about to provide some cushioning and to mask the smells that would otherwise overwhelm you. Your bed would be a wooden frame supporting a mattress stuffed with straw or feathers, if you were particularly fortunate. But here's the thing about medieval mattresses. They were living ecosystems. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and mice all called your sleeping space home. Every night was a battle for territory, and you rarely won. The windows in your room, assuming you had any, would be narrow slits designed to let archers shoot out while keeping enemies from shooting in. Glass was incredibly rare and expensive, so most windows were simply openings in the stone, sometimes covered with oiled parchment or thin animal hide. In winter, you'd stuff them with straw or cloth to keep out the worst of the wind, but that meant your room became a dark, airless cave. You'd wake up each morning with frost on your blankets and your breath forming clouds in the air. But let's say you managed to survive the night without freezing. Now you need to get dressed. And this is where the medieval experience becomes truly alien to modern life. First, there's no closet full of clean clothes waiting for you. You might own 2 sets of clothing if you're lucky, one to wear and one to wash. Though washing happened so infrequently that the concept of clean was more aspirational than actual. Your clothes would be made of rough wool or linen, scratchy against your skin and often damp from the castle's perpetual moisture. Getting dressed was a production. Medieval clothing was designed to be worn in layers, partly for warmth and partly for modesty. You'd start with a linen undergarment, then add a tunic, then perhaps a surcoat, and finally a cloak. But here's what no historical drama ever shows you. Putting on these clothes was often painful. The fabric was coarse, the seams were rough, and everything was held together with ties, pins, and crude fastenings that pinched and pulled. By the time you were fully dressed, you'd already be exhausted, and the day hadn't even begun. And speaking of the day beginning, let's talk about that most basic of human needs, using the bathroom. In your modern life, you walk a few steps to a private room with running water, soft tissue, and immediate disposal of waste. In a medieval castle, relieving yourself was a public, uncomfortable, and often dangerous affair. The castle's latrines were built into the walls, essentially stone seats with holes that dropped waste directly into the moat or a pit below. There was no privacy, no running water, and certainly no toilet paper. You'd use whatever was available, straw, leaves, or scraps of cloth, and hope for the best. But the real horror of medieval castle bathrooms wasn't the lack of amenities, it was the smell and the health risks. These latrines were breeding grounds for disease. The waste below would ferment and rot, creating toxic fumes that rose back up through the holes. Many castle dwellers suffered from what we'd now recognise as respiratory problems, skin infections, and digestive issues, all directly related to the unsanitary conditions they lived with daily. And in winter, when the wind howled through the castle, those latrine holes became like wind tunnels, creating drafts so cold that using the bathroom became an act of genuine courage. Now, let's assume you've managed to dress yourself and take care of your bodily needs. It's time for breakfast, and this is where the medieval experience becomes truly medieval. There's no kitchen in your room, no refrigerator, no microwave. Food in a medieval castle was prepared in a great hall kitchen, usually located far from the living quarters to reduce fire risk. This meant that by the time food reached your table, it was lukewarm at best, stone cold at worst. The meal itself would be a shock to modern sensibilities. Breakfast, if it existed at all, might consist of bread, ale, and perhaps some cheese or cold meat from the previous day. But this wasn't the soft, fluffy bread you're used to. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often gritty from the stone ground flour. It had the texture of cardboard, and sometimes contained actual bits of stone from the grinding process. The ale wasn't a recreational beverage. It was safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated with waste and disease. And here's something that would truly horrify a modern person. There were no individual plates or utensils. You'd eat from a large wooden trencher, essentially a hollowed-out piece of bread that served as both plate and food. You'd share this with whoever was sitting next to you, using your hands or a knife to cut and eat your food. The concept of personal hygiene around food was non-existent. People ate with unwashed hands, shared cups, and thought nothing of reaching across others to grab what they wanted. The Great Hall, where meals were served, would be an assault on your senses. Smoke from the central fire would fill the air, making your eyes water and your throat burn. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and animal waste would be overwhelming. Dogs would wander freely, fighting over scraps and relieving themselves wherever they pleased. The noise would be deafening, with dozens of people talking, laughing, arguing, and eating all at once in a stone chamber that echoed every sound. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of castle dining would be the social hierarchy that governed every aspect of the meal. If you weren't nobility, you wouldn't eat until the nobles had finished. You'd stand and wait, watching others eat while your own stomach growled. And when you finally got your turn, you'd get the scraps, the burnt pieces, the parts that others had rejected. The best food, the fresh bread, the meat, the wine, all of that was reserved for those born into the right families. This rigid social structure wasn't just about food, it permeated every aspect of castle life. Your value as a person was determined entirely by your birth, and that value dictated everything from where you slept, to what you ate, to whether you lived or died. If you were a servant, you were essentially property. You could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed with minimal consequence. The idea of individual rights, of personal freedom, of being able to choose your own path in life, these concepts simply didn't exist. After breakfast, assuming you survived the experience, you'd need to find something to do with your day. And this is where the medieval castle experience becomes truly alien to modern life. There was no entertainment in the sense we understand it, no books to read, unless you were one of the tiny percentage of people who could read. No music, unless someone in the castle happened to play an instrument. No games, no sports, no hobbies. Your day would be filled with work, endless, backbreaking, dangerous work. If you were a servant, you might spend your day hauling water from the well, a task that sounds simple until you realize that water had to be carried up multiple flights of stone stairs in heavy wooden buckets. The well itself might be contaminated with waste, dead animals, or worse. You'd make this trip dozens of times a day, your back aching, your hands raw from the rough rope handles. Or perhaps you'd be assigned to tend the fires, another task that sounds straightforward, but was actually incredibly dangerous. Medieval castles were tinderboxes filled with straw, wood, and cloth. One misplaced spark could turn the entire structure into an inferno. You'd spend your day carefully feeding fires, cleaning out ash, and hauling firewood up endless flights of stairs. The smoke would burn your eyes and lungs, the heat would leave you dehydrated, and the constant fear of starting an accidental fire would keep you on edge every moment. And then there was the matter of personal safety. Modern life, for all its stresses, offers a level of physical security that medieval people could never imagine. You lock your doors, you call the police if threatened, you have legal protections and social services. In a medieval castle, violence was a daily reality. Arguments were settled with fists or knives. Theft was common, and punishment was swift and brutal. If you were accused of a crime, there was no trial by jury, no legal representation, no presumption of innocence. Justice was dispensed by whoever held power, and it was often arbitrary and cruel. The very architecture of the castle was designed around the assumption that violence was inevitable. The narrow staircases spiraled clockwise, giving defenders an advantage over attackers. The walls were built to withstand siege engines. The entire structure was essentially a fortress designed to keep people out and to survive extended periods of warfare. Living in such a place would be a constant reminder that danger was always present, that safety was temporary, and that survival required constant vigilance. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of medieval castle life would be the complete lack of privacy. In our modern world, we take for granted the ability to be alone, to have personal space, to retreat from others when we need solitude. In a medieval castle, privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. You'd sleep in rooms with multiple other people. You'd eat in communal halls. You'd work alongside others constantly. Even your most private moments, bathing, relieving yourself, changing clothes, would be shared experiences. This lack of privacy extended to your thoughts and beliefs as well. The medieval world was one of rigid conformity, where questioning authority or expressing unconventional ideas could literally get you killed. The church controlled not just spiritual life, but intellectual life as well. Books were rare and heavily censored. Education was limited to a tiny elite. The concept of free thought, of individual expression, of personal autonomy, these ideas were not just rare, they were dangerous. And yet, for all these hardships, people did survive in medieval castles. They adapted, they endured, they found ways to make the best of impossible circumstances. They created communities, formed relationships, and built lives within the constraints of their harsh world. But the key word here is survived. They didn't thrive in the way we understand the term. They didn't live long, healthy, comfortable lives. They simply endured day after day, year after year, until disease, violence, or simple exhaustion finally claimed them. The average life expectancy in medieval times was somewhere between 30 and 40 years, and that's being generous. Most people died young, worn down by the constant struggle to survive in a world that offered few comforts and fewer opportunities. The idea of retirement, of leisure time, of pursuing personal interests or hobbies, these concepts were utterly foreign to medieval life. So as you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, surrounded by the conveniences of modern life, take a moment to appreciate just how extraordinary your existence really is. The warmth that surrounds you, the clean water that flows from your taps, the soft clothes that protect your skin, the privacy that allows you to be alone with your thoughts. All of these things would have been unimaginable luxuries to someone living in a medieval castle. The medical care available in a medieval castle would make your worst hospital experience seem like a luxury spa visit. When you got sick, and you would get sick constantly, there was no calling a doctor. There was no doctor. Instead, you'd rely on whoever in the castle claimed to have healing knowledge, often a monk who'd learned a few herbal remedies, or an old woman who'd picked up folk treatments through trial and error. Their understanding of medicine was a fascinating blend of superstition, religion, and accidental wisdom. A headache might be treated by drilling a hole in your skull to release evil spirits. A broken bone would be set with splints and prayers, assuming you were lucky enough to have someone who knew how to do even that much. Most medical treatments involved bloodletting, the practice of deliberately cutting you open to drain blood, based on the theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. The tools they used would horrify any modern medical professional. Rusty knives, unsterilized needles, and crude saws were the height of surgical technology. There was no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no understanding of infection or disease transmission. A simple cut that you'd barely notice today could easily become infected and kill you within days. Childbirth was essentially a death sentence for many women, with mortality rates that would be unthinkable in our modern world. And the remedies they prescribed were often worse than the diseases they were meant to treat. Moldy bread for wounds, mercury for skin conditions, and various animal parts mixed with herbs for internal ailments. Many of these treatments were actively harmful, poisoning patients or causing additional injuries. The fact that anyone survived medieval medicine is a testament to human resilience rather than medical skill. But perhaps even more challenging than the lack of medical care was the complete absence of mental health support. The stresses of medieval castle life, the constant threat of violence, the grinding poverty, the social oppression, all of these would take a tremendous toll on your psychological well-being. Depression, anxiety, and what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress were common, but there was no understanding of mental illness as a treatable condition. Instead, mental health problems were often attributed to demonic possession, moral weakness, or divine punishment. The treatments were accordingly brutal. People suffering from mental illness might be chained up, beaten, or exiled from the community. There was no therapy, no medication, no support systems. You were expected to simply endure whatever psychological torment you experienced, and if you couldn't, you were seen as weak or cursed. The isolation would be particularly difficult for someone from our modern world. We're used to constant connection, to being able to reach out to friends and family instantly, to having access to endless entertainment and information. In a medieval castle, you might go days without meaningful conversation. Letters were rare and expensive, travel was dangerous and difficult, and most people lived their entire lives within a radius of just a few miles. This isolation was made worse by the language barriers that existed even within the same region. Different areas had different dialects, different customs, different ways of life. Even if you could travel, you might find yourself unable to communicate with people just a few villages away. The idea of a shared national identity, of common culture and language, was still centuries in the future. The work itself would break your modern sensibilities in ways you can't imagine. Everything was done by hand, with primitive tools, under dangerous conditions. If you were assigned to work in the castle's blacksmith shop, you'd spend your days in a sweltering, smoke-filled room, hammering red-hot metal with crude tools. The heat would be unbearable, the smoke would choke you, and the constant noise would leave your ears ringing for hours. Or perhaps you'd be sent to work in the castle's brewery, where you'd spend your days stirring massive vats of fermenting grain with wooden paddles. The smell would be overwhelming, the work would be backbreaking, and the constant moisture would leave you permanently damp and uncomfortable. And this wasn't a job you could quit when you got tired of it. You'd do this same work day after day, year after year, until your body simply couldn't take it anymore. The seasonal changes would affect your life in ways that modern heating and cooling systems have made us forget. Winter in a medieval castle wasn't just cold, it was a months-long battle for survival. Food would become scarce, stored supplies would run low, and the cold would become so intense that people would literally freeze to death in their beds. You'd go to sleep each night, not knowing if you'd wake up in the morning. Summer brought its own challenges. The thick stone walls that provided some insulation in winter would trap heat in summer, turning your living space into an oven. There was no air conditioning, no fans, no way to cool down except to strip off layers of clothing, which wasn't socially acceptable. You'd sweat constantly, your clothes would stick to your skin, and the combination of heat, humidity, and poor ventilation would create conditions that bred disease and discomfort. The smell alone would be enough to send most modern people running. Medieval castles were essentially large collections of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food, and stagnant water. The rushes on the floors would be changed infrequently, allowing them to become repositories for spilled food, urine, and worse. The great hall would reek of smoke, grease, and human waste. Even the sleeping quarters would smell of sweat, dirty clothes, and the chamber pots that served as toilets. Personal hygiene was not just poor by modern standards, it was practically non-existent. People might bathe a few times a year, if that. They'd wear the same clothes for weeks or months without washing them. They'd use their hands to eat, then wipe them on their clothes or on whatever was handy. The concept of washing your hands before eating or after using the latrine was unknown. Dental care consisted of chewing on twigs or rubbing your teeth with cloth. This lack of hygiene had consequences that went far beyond mere discomfort. Skin diseases were rampant. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Infections were common and often fatal. The combination of poor nutrition, unsanitary conditions, and lack of medical care created a perfect storm for disease transmission. Plagues would sweep through castles regularly, killing large percentages of the population in a matter of weeks. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of medieval castle life would be the complete lack of hope for improvement. In our modern world, we believe in progress, in the possibility of bettering our circumstances through education, hard work, or innovation. We plan for the future, set goals, and work toward achieving them. In medieval times, your social position was fixed from birth. If you were born a peasant, you'd die a peasant. If you were born a servant, you'd spend your entire life serving others. There was no social mobility, no opportunity for advancement, no chance to change your circumstances through effort or talent. Your life was predetermined by the accident of your birth, and questioning that system was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. The entire social structure was built around the idea that some people were inherently better than others, that hierarchy was natural and divinely ordained. This system of rigid social stratification would be particularly difficult for someone from our modern democratic society to accept. We're used to the idea that all people are created equal, that everyone deserves basic rights and opportunities. In a medieval castle, these concepts would be not just foreign but literally heretical. The idea that a peasant might be as valuable as a noble, that a servant might have the same rights as a lord, would be seen as a dangerous attack on the natural order. The legal system, such as it was, would be equally alien to modern sensibilities. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to a fair trial, no protection against arbitrary punishment. Justice was dispensed by whoever held power, and it was often swift, brutal, and final. Theft might be punished by having your hand cut off. Speaking against your lord might earn you a beating or worse. The concept of due process, of legal representation, of appeals, these protections simply didn't exist. And yet, for all these hardships, medieval people found ways to create meaning in their lives. They formed deep bonds with their families and communities. They found solace in religious faith. They created art, music, and literature that still moves us today. They built magnificent cathedrals and castles that stand as testaments to human creativity and determination. But they did all of this despite their circumstances, not because of them. The children born into this world would face challenges that would break the hearts of modern parents. Infant mortality was staggering, with many babies dying before their first birthday. Those who survived childhood would face a lifetime of hard labor, poor nutrition, and constant danger. Education was limited to a tiny elite, meaning that most people would live their entire lives unable to read or write. The idea of childhood as a time of play, learning, and protection was unknown. Children were expected to work as soon as they were able, often in dangerous conditions that would be considered child abuse today. Even the basic human need for companionship and love would be complicated by the harsh realities of medieval life. Marriages were typically arranged for economic or political reasons rather than affection. Romance, as we understand it, was a luxury that few could afford. People formed attachments and found happiness where they could, but always within the constraints of a system that valued property and power over personal fulfillment. The religious life that dominated medieval society would be both a comfort and a burden. Faith provided meaning and hope in a world that offered little of either, but it also imposed strict rules and limitations on behavior. The church controlled not just spiritual life, but intellectual and social life as well. Questioning religious doctrine was not just discouraged, it was punishable by death. The concept of religious freedom, of being able to choose your own beliefs, was inconceivable. As night falls around you now, in your comfortable modern home, with your soft bed and clean sheets waiting, with the knowledge that tomorrow will bring new opportunities and possibilities, it's worth reflecting on just how extraordinary your life really is. The freedoms you take for granted, the comforts you barely notice, the opportunities that seem ordinary to you, all of these would have been unimaginable miracles to someone living in a medieval castle. They survived, yes, but at a cost that we can barely comprehend. They endured hardships that would break most of us within days. They found ways to live, to love, to create meaning in a world that offered them little hope and fewer choices. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the world we inhabit today, a world where survival is not the daily struggle it once was, where comfort is not a rare luxury, but a common expectation. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your climate-controlled room, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the miracle of your existence, the soft pillow beneath your head, the clean water flowing from your tap, the simple ability to flip a switch and banish darkness. These aren't just conveniences. They're victories won over centuries of human struggle, paid for by generations who knew nothing but cold stone and flickering flames. The entertainment that filled medieval castle evenings would seem primitive beyond belief to our modern sensibilities. While you might unwind tonight with a book, a movie, or endless streaming options, castle dwellers had to create their own amusement from whatever scraps they could find. If you were fortunate enough to be in the Great Hall during a feast, you might witness a travelling minstrel or storyteller. But these were rare treats, not nightly occurrences. More often, entertainment consisted of listening to the same stories told over and over again by whoever had the gift of narrative. These tales, passed down through generations, would be embellished and changed with each telling, creating a kind of communal fiction that everyone knew by heart. The stories were usually about brave knights, distant lands, and impossible quests, serving as escapism for people whose own lives offered precious little adventure beyond the daily struggle to survive. Games existed, but they were simple affairs. Dice carved from animal bones, crude board games played with stones, or physical contests that often ended in injury. The concept of organized sports was unknown, though young men might engage in mock combat or wrestling matches that served as both entertainment and training for actual warfare. These contests were brutal affairs, with serious injuries common and medical care virtually non-existent. Music was another rarity that would shock someone accustomed to having access to infinite songs at the touch of a button. A castle might have one or two people who could play simple instruments, usually crude flutes or drums. The idea of harmony, of complex musical arrangements, of the rich tapestries of sound we take for granted, these were luxuries beyond imagination. When music did occur, it was often accompanied by dancing, but even this was limited by the cramped spaces and social hierarchies that governed every aspect of castle life. The long winter evenings would stretch endlessly, filled with little more than the maintenance of fires and the mending of clothes. People would gather around the hearth, not for warmth alone, but for the comfort of human presence in a world that could be crushingly lonely. They'd share the day's gossip, discuss the weather, or simply sit in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind howl through the stone corridors. But perhaps the most alien aspect of medieval castle entertainment would be the complete absence of privacy for leisure activities. There was no retreating to your room with a good book, no putting on headphones to escape into music, no quiet moments of solitary reflection. Everything was communal, shared, observed by others. Even your thoughts weren't entirely your own, as the church maintained strict control over what ideas were acceptable to contemplate. The concept of personal hobbies would be utterly foreign to medieval castle dwellers. While you might spend your free time pursuing photography, gardening, or learning new skills online, castle residents had no free time in the modern sense. Every moment was accounted for, every activity had a purpose related to survival or duty. The idea of doing something simply because you enjoyed it, of pursuing knowledge or skills for personal fulfillment, was a luxury that few could afford. Even the basic act of learning was restricted to a tiny elite. Books were incredibly rare and expensive, handwritten by monks in monasteries and available only to the wealthy and educated. The vast majority of castle dwellers were illiterate, cut off from the world of written knowledge, and dependent on oral tradition for any information beyond their immediate experience. The concept of universal education, of public libraries, of the democratization of knowledge, these were ideas that wouldn't emerge for centuries. The psychological impact of this intellectual isolation would be profound. Imagine spending your entire life without access to books, without the ability to read about distant places or different ideas, without the mental stimulation that comes from engaging with complex thoughts and concepts. Your world would be limited to what you could see, hear, and directly experience, creating a kind of intellectual claustrophobia that would be unbearable to most modern minds. The social interactions that did occur would be governed by rigid protocols that determined who could speak to whom, when, and how. A servant could not address a noble directly without permission. Women were expected to remain silent in most social situations. Children were seen and not heard, quite literally. The free-flowing conversations we take for granted, the ability to express opinions and engage in debate, these were privileges reserved for a tiny minority of the population. Even the physical spaces of the castle would contribute to a sense of psychological oppression. The narrow corridors, the low ceilings, the thick walls that blocked out natural light, all of these architectural features would create a feeling of confinement that would be particularly difficult for someone accustomed to open spaces and abundant light. The castle was designed to keep enemies out, but it also kept its inhabitants in, creating a kind of luxurious prison for those who lived within its walls. The seasonal rhythms of castle life would impose their own psychological challenges. Winter months would bring not just physical hardship, but a kind of emotional hibernation, as people retreated into themselves and endured the long, dark nights with little to occupy their minds. Spring would bring relief, but also the anxiety of knowing that another winter was inevitable. The cycle of seasons would mark time not with anticipation and variety, but with dread and resignation. The religious observances that punctuated medieval life would provide some structure and meaning, but they would also impose additional burdens and restrictions. Daily prayers, weekly masses, seasonal festivals, all of these would be mandatory rather than optional. The concept of choosing your own spiritual path, of questioning religious doctrine, of finding meaning outside of established traditions, these ideas would be not just discouraged but dangerous. The feast days and religious holidays that broke the monotony of daily life would be eagerly anticipated, but they would also highlight the stark differences between the lives of the nobility and the common people. While the lords and ladies enjoyed elaborate meals and entertainment, the servants and peasants would be lucky to receive scraps from the table. These celebrations would serve as reminders of social hierarchy rather than opportunities for genuine communal joy. The treatment of women in medieval castle society would be particularly shocking to modern sensibilities. Women had virtually no legal rights, no political power, and no economic independence. They were considered property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. Even noble women, despite their elevated social status, were subject to the absolute authority of the men in their lives. The idea of gender equality, of women pursuing careers or making independent choices, would be literally unthinkable. The lives of children would be equally harsh by modern standards. Childhood, as we understand it, as a time of play and learning and protection, simply didn't exist. Children were expected to contribute to the household economy as soon as they were able, often working in dangerous conditions that would horrify modern parents. Education was limited to a tiny elite, and even then focused primarily on religious instruction and basic literacy. The concept of nurturing a child's individual talents and interests was unknown. The elderly, those few who managed to survive to advanced age, would face their own particular challenges. There was no social security system, no retirement benefits, no medical care for age-related ailments. Old people were dependent on the charity of their families or communities, and that charity was often grudgingly given. The wisdom and experience of age were respected in theory, but in practice, the elderly were often seen as burdens rather than assets. The violence that permeated medieval castle life would be perhaps the most difficult aspect for a modern person to accept. Physical punishment was common and accepted, not just as a form of justice, but as a method of maintaining order. Servants were beaten for minor infractions, children were whipped for disobedience, and even nobles might face violent retribution for crossing their superiors. The concept of resolving conflicts through discussion and compromise was foreign to a world where might made right. The medical knowledge available in medieval times would seem like primitive superstition to anyone accustomed to modern healthcare. Diseases that we can cure with simple antibiotics were death sentences. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or sterile conditions. The understanding of anatomy and physiology was so limited that treatments often did more harm than good. The idea of preventive medicine, of maintaining health through proper diet and exercise, was unknown. The dental care available would be particularly horrifying. Tooth decay was common and painful, but there was no effective treatment. Teeth were sometimes pulled with crude instruments, but more often people simply endured the pain until the tooth fell out, or they died from infection. The concept of dental hygiene of regular cleaning and maintenance, was unknown. Most people would have terrible breath, missing teeth, and constant oral pain. The clothing worn in medieval castles would be uncomfortable and impractical by modern standards. Garments were made from rough fabrics that chafed the skin, and they were often ill-fitting and poorly constructed. Underwear as we know it didn't exist, and people wore the same clothes for weeks or months without washing them. The concept of having a wardrobe of different outfits for different occasions was a luxury available only to the wealthy. Even the basic act of staying clean would be a constant struggle. There were no showers, no running water, no soap as we know it. People might bathe occasionally in wooden tubs filled with water that had been heated over a fire, but this was a laborious process that couldn't be undertaken frequently. Most personal hygiene consisted of wiping down with cloth and water, if water was available. The concept of daily bathing, of feeling clean and fresh, would be unknown to most castle dwellers. The sleep patterns of medieval people would be alien to our modern understanding of rest. Without artificial lighting, people went to bed shortly after sunset and woke at dawn. But sleep wasn't the uninterrupted 8-hour stretch we're accustomed to. People would often wake in the middle of the night for a period of activity before returning to sleep. This segmented sleep pattern was considered normal, but it would be disorienting to someone used to sleeping through the night. The beds themselves would be uncomfortable and unhygienic. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers that quickly became compressed and lumpy. Bedding was rarely washed, and it harbored insects and parasites. The concept of fresh sheets, of a comfortable mattress, of a clean and quiet sleeping environment, these were luxuries beyond imagination. Most people would share beds with family members or other castle residents, making privacy and restful sleep nearly impossible. The food storage and preparation methods would seem primitive and dangerous to modern eyes. There was no refrigeration, so food had to be preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods were not always effective, and spoiled food was common. The concept of food safety, of knowing whether something was safe to eat, was based on smell and appearance, rather than scientific understanding. Food poisoning was common and often fatal. The cooking methods available would be limited and crude. Most food was boiled in large pots over open fires, resulting in meals that were often overcooked and bland. Seasonings were expensive and rare, so most food was tasteless by modern standards. The concept of cuisine, of cooking as an art form, was unknown to most castle dwellers. Meals were about survival, not enjoyment. The social hierarchy that governed every aspect of castle life would be suffocating to someone accustomed to modern equality. Your birth determined your entire life trajectory, and there was no possibility of advancement through merit or effort. The concept of social mobility, of being able to improve your circumstances through hard work, was unknown. You were born into a caste, and you would die in that caste, regardless of your talents or ambitions. The legal system would be equally alien to modern sensibilities. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, no appeal process. Justice was dispensed by whoever held power, and it was often arbitrary and cruel. The concept of due process, of fair treatment under the law, was unknown. Your fate depended not on the facts of your case, but on the whims of those who ruled over you. And yet, despite all these hardships, medieval people found ways to create meaning and beauty in their lives. They formed deep bonds with their families and communities. They created magnificent art and architecture that still inspires us today. They developed systems of governance and law that laid the foundation for our modern world. But they did all of this while enduring conditions that would break most of us within days. As you prepare for sleep tonight, surrounded by the comforts of modern life, remember that you are living in a way that would have been inconceivable to someone in a medieval castle. The warmth that surrounds you, the clean water at your fingertips, the soft bed that awaits you. These are not just conveniences, but miracles of human progress. You are living better than kings and queens of centuries past, and that is something worth remembering as you drift off to sleep. The medieval castle was not the romantic fantasy of movies and fairy tales. It was a harsh, demanding, dangerous place where survival was a daily accomplishment and comfort was a rare luxury. Those who lived within its walls were shaped by hardship, defined by duty, and limited by circumstances beyond their control. Their lives were short, difficult, and often brutal. But they endured, and in enduring, they created the foundation for the world we inhabit today. So sleep well tonight, knowing that you have inherited the fruits of their struggle. The freedoms you enjoy, the comforts you take for granted, the opportunities that seem ordinary to you, all of these are gifts from those who came before, who endured the cold stone and flickering flames, so that you might know warmth and light. Rest easy, for you are living in the best of times, even if it doesn't always feel that way. The economic system that governed medieval castle life would be utterly bewildering to someone accustomed to modern capitalism. There was no money as we understand it, no banks, no credit systems, no economic mobility. Instead, everything operated on a complex web of obligations, debts, and feudal duties that bound people together in relationships of mutual dependence and exploitation. Your labor had no monetary value in the traditional sense. If you were a serf or a peasant, you owed your lord a certain number of days of work each week, regardless of how you felt about it. There was no concept of fair wages, of overtime pay, of workers' rights. You worked because you had to, and you worked until you couldn't anymore. The idea of choosing your career, of pursuing your passions, of building wealth through investment or entrepreneurship, these concepts were not just foreign, but literally impossible within the feudal system. The castle itself operated like a small, isolated economy where everything had to be produced locally. There were no supply chains, no global trade networks, no just-in-time delivery systems. If the castle needed bread, someone had to grow the grain, mill the flour, and bake the loaves. If it needed clothing, someone had to raise the sheep, spin the wool, weave the fabric, and sew the garments. Every necessity of life required enormous amounts of human labor, and that labor was provided by people who had no choice in the matter. The seasonal nature of medieval life would impose rhythms that modern people would find restrictive and exhausting. Your entire existence would revolve around the agricultural calendar, with different seasons bringing different demands and challenges. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending crops, autumn meant harvest, and winter meant survival. There was no escaping this cycle, no taking vacations, no choosing to work different hours or in different seasons. Your life was dictated by the weather, the soil, and the inexorable passage of time. The preservation of food would be a constant anxiety that would consume enormous amounts of time and energy. Without refrigeration, every meal had to be planned around what was available and what could be safely eaten. Meat had to be consumed quickly after slaughter or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Vegetables had to be eaten in season or stored in root cellars that might or might not keep them fresh. The concept of food waste, of throwing away perfectly good food because you didn't feel like eating it, would be unthinkable in a world where starvation was always a real possibility. The tools and technology available would seem laughably primitive to someone accustomed to modern conveniences. Everything was made by hand, with simple tools that required enormous skill to use effectively. A blacksmith might spend years learning to make a single horseshoe properly. A carpenter might work for months to create a simple wooden chest. The idea of mass production, of standardized parts, of machines that could do the work of dozens of people was centuries in the future. The communication systems would be equally primitive and unreliable. There was no postal service, no telephone, no internet. Messages were carried by human messengers who might take days or weeks to reach their destination. assuming they didn't get lost, robbed, or killed along the way. The concept of instant communication, of being able to reach someone anywhere in the world within seconds, would be pure magic to medieval minds. The timekeeping systems would be approximate at best. There were no clocks, no watches, no precise ways of measuring time. People estimated the time by the position of the sun, the ringing of church bells, or the completion of certain tasks. The concept of punctuality, of scheduling meetings to the minute, of coordinating complex activities across different locations, would be impossible in a world where time itself was fluid and approximate. The transportation systems would be slow, dangerous, and unreliable. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Those who did travel had to walk, ride horses, or use crude carts pulled by oxen. Roads were little more than muddy tracks that became impassable in bad weather. The concept of rapid transit, of being able to travel hundreds of miles in a single day, would be inconceivable to people who might spend weeks walking to the next town. The information systems would be limited to what people could remember and pass along through oral tradition. There were no newspapers, no books for common people, no way of learning about events in distant places. Your knowledge of the world would be restricted to what you could see with your own eyes and what others told you, and much of that information would be distorted, exaggerated, or completely false by the time it reached you. The educational systems would be virtually non-existent for most people. Reading and writing were skills possessed by a tiny elite, mainly clergy and nobility. The concept of universal education, of every child having the right to learn, was unknown. Most people would live their entire lives without ever seeing a book, let alone reading one. Knowledge was passed down through apprenticeships and oral instruction, limiting what could be learned and how quickly it could be acquired. The healthcare systems would be based on superstition, tradition, and guesswork rather than scientific understanding. Diseases that we can cure with simple medications were death sentences. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or understanding of infection control. The concept of preventive medicine, of maintaining health through proper diet and exercise, was unknown. Most people would suffer from chronic pain, dental problems, and various ailments that would be easily treatable today. The social welfare systems would be based on charity and personal relationships rather than institutional support. There was no unemployment insurance, no disability benefits, no social security. If you couldn't work, you depended on the goodwill of your family, your community, or your lord. If that goodwill was withdrawn, you could easily starve or freeze to death. The concept of social safety nets, of collective responsibility for the welfare of all citizens, was centuries in the future. The entertainment systems would be limited to what people could create themselves. There was no mass media, no professional entertainment industry, no way of accessing cultural products created by others. If you wanted music, someone in your community had to play an instrument. If you wanted stories, someone had to tell them. If you wanted visual art, someone had to create it locally. The concept of consuming entertainment created by professionals in distant locations was impossible. The housing systems would be crude and uncomfortable by modern standards. Most people lived in single-room structures with dirt floors, no windows and minimal furniture. Privacy was unknown, with entire families sharing the same space. The concept of having your own room, your own bed, your own personal space was a luxury available only to the wealthy. Most people would sleep on straw mattresses that harbored insects and vermin. The clothing systems would be based on functionality rather than fashion or comfort. Garments were made from rough materials that chafed the skin and were often ill-fitting and poorly constructed. People might own only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, which they would wear until they literally fell apart. The concept of having a wardrobe of different outfits for different occasions was unknown to most castle dwellers. The water systems would be unreliable and often contaminated. There was no running water, no water treatment, no way of ensuring that the water you drank was safe. Wells could be contaminated by animal waste, human sewage, or rotting organic matter. The concept of turning a handle and having clean, safe water flow out was pure fantasy. Most people would drink ale or wine because it was safer than water. The waste management systems would be primitive and unsanitary. Human waste was collected in chamber pots and dumped into moats or pits. There was no sewage treatment, no understanding of how waste disposal affected public health. The concept of flush toilets, of waste being carried away cleanly and efficiently, was unknown. Most people would live surrounded by the smell and health hazards of inadequate waste management. The lighting systems would be limited to candles, oil lamps, and fires. There was no electric lighting, no way of banishing darkness at the flip of a switch. Most activities had to be completed during daylight hours, and evening activities were limited to what could be done by flickering candlelight. The concept of being able to work or read comfortably after dark was a luxury available only to the wealthy. The climate control systems would be non-existent. There was no central heating, no air conditioning, no way of maintaining comfortable temperatures year-round. People would be cold in winter and hot in summer, with no relief except what they could create through clothing, fires, or seeking shelter. The concept of maintaining a comfortable temperature, regardless of weather conditions, was unknown. The security systems would be based on physical barriers and human guards, rather than sophisticated technology. Castle walls, locked doors, and armed sentries were the primary means of protection. There was no police force, no emergency services, no way of calling for help in times of crisis. The concept of institutional security, of professional law enforcement, was centuries in the future. The financial systems would be based on barter, obligation, and personal relationships rather than monetary exchange. There was no banking system, no credit, no way of storing wealth except in physical goods. The concept of abstract financial instruments, of earning interest on investments, of building wealth through financial markets, was unknown. Most people would live their entire lives without ever seeing a coin. The legal systems would be based on custom, tradition, and the arbitrary decisions of those in power, rather than written law and due process. There was no constitution, no Bill of Rights, no protection against arbitrary punishment. Justice was dispensed by whoever held power, and it was often swift, harsh, and final. The concept of legal representation, of appeals, of due process, was unknown to most people. The transportation systems would be slow, dangerous, and unreliable. Most people never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Those who did travel had to walk, ride horses, or use crude carts pulled by animals. Roads were little more than muddy tracks that became impassable in bad weather. The concept of rapid, safe, reliable transportation was unknown. And yet, despite all these hardships and limitations, medieval people found ways to create meaning, beauty, and community in their lives. They formed deep bonds with their families and neighbours. They created magnificent art and architecture that still inspires us today. They developed systems of governance and law that laid the foundation for our modern world. They found joy in simple pleasures, comfort in religious faith, and purpose in their daily work. But they did all of this while enduring conditions that would break most of us within days. They survived not because life was easy, but because they had no choice. They adapted not because they wanted to, but because adaptation was the only alternative to death. They found happiness not because their circumstances were pleasant, but because human beings have a remarkable capacity to find light even in the darkest places. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, surrounded by the countless miracles of modern life, remember that you are living in a way that would have been inconceivable to someone in a medieval castle. The warmth that surrounds you, the clean water at your fingertips, the soft bed that awaits you, the safety and security you take for granted. These are not just conveniences, but the fruits of centuries of human struggle and progress. You are living better than kings and queens of centuries past, and that is something worth remembering as you drift off to sleep. The medieval castle was not the romantic fantasy of movies and fairy tales. It was a harsh, demanding, dangerous place where survival was a daily accomplishment and comfort was a rare luxury. Those who lived within its walls were shaped by hardship, defined by duty, and limited by circumstances beyond their control. Their lives were short, difficult, and often brutal, but they endured, and in enduring, they created the foundation for the world we inhabit today. So sleep well tonight, knowing that you have inherited the fruits of their struggle, the freedoms you enjoy, the comforts you take for granted, the opportunities that seem ordinary to you. All of these are gifts from those who came before, who endured the cold stone and flickering flames so that you might know warmth and light. Rest easy, for you are living in the best of times, even if it doesn't always feel that way. And as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, perhaps spare a thought for those long-ago souls who faced each day with courage and determination, who built something lasting from the harsh materials of their world, and who remind us that human resilience and dignity can flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. The spiritual life that permeated every aspect of medieval castle existence would be perhaps the most suffocating element for someone accustomed to modern religious freedom. Your faith wasn't a personal choice or a source of comfort you could turn to when needed. It was a rigid framework that governed every moment of your existence, from the prayers you recited upon waking to the confessions you whispered before sleep. The day began with mandatory prayers, usually before dawn, regardless of how you felt or what work awaited you. These weren't brief, personal moments of reflection, but lengthy, formal recitations in Latin that most people couldn't understand. You'd kneel on cold stone floors, your breath visible in the frigid air, mumbling words that had been handed down through generations without questioning their meaning or relevance to your life. The church calendar dictated not just when you worked and when you rested, but what you could eat, when you could marry, and how you could express grief or joy. Feast days meant mandatory celebrations, whether you felt festive or not. Fast days meant hunger, even if you were already malnourished. Holy days meant setting aside urgent work to attend lengthy services in drafty chapels. Listening to sermons about sins you might not have even known existed. The concept of religious doubt, of questioning doctrine, of exploring different spiritual paths, was not just discouraged, but literally life-threatening. Heresy was punishable by death, and the definition of heresy was broad enough to include almost any original thought about God, salvation, or the nature of existence. You'd learn to keep your questions to yourself, to nod along with teachings that might seem contradictory or cruel, and to find comfort in conformity rather than truth. The priests who ministered to castle communities were often as ignorant as those they served, having learned their Latin by rote without understanding its meaning. They'd dispense spiritual advice based on tradition and superstition rather than wisdom or compassion. Your spiritual life would be mediated through men who might be corrupt, ignorant, or simply going through the motions of faith without genuine conviction. The guilt that pervaded medieval religious life would be psychologically crushing. You'd be taught that you were born sinful, that your natural desires were evil, that your very existence was an offense to God that required constant penance. Every pleasure, every moment of happiness, every human impulse would be filtered through the lens of potential sin. The concept of a loving, forgiving God who wanted you to flourish would be foreign to a religious system built on fear and shame. The rituals that marked important life events would be elaborate performances that had little to do with your actual feelings or experiences. Baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and funerals would follow prescribed scripts that left no room for personal expression or individual meaning. You'd participate in these ceremonies not because they resonated with your beliefs, but because failure to do so would mark you as dangerously different. The superstitions that intertwined with official religious doctrine would create a world where every event, every illness, every stroke of fortune was interpreted through a lens of divine punishment or reward. Bad weather meant God was angry. Good harvests meant the community was righteous. Personal tragedy meant you or someone close to you had committed some unnamed sin. This constant search for spiritual meaning in random events would create a level of anxiety and self-doubt that would be unbearable to modern minds. The economic pressures that religious obligations imposed would be particularly burdensome for those already struggling to survive. The church demanded not just tithes and offerings, but labor, materials, and time that could have been spent on essential tasks. You'd watch precious resources flow to religious institutions while your own family went hungry, all in the name of securing salvation in an afterlife that seemed increasingly distant from your daily suffering. The religious art and architecture that surrounded you would be magnificent but also oppressive, constant reminders of your own insignificance in the grand scheme of divine judgment. The soaring cathedrals, the golden altars, the jeweled reliquaries would speak of a God who demanded beauty and wealth, while his followers lived in squalor. The contrast between the splendor of religious buildings and the poverty of daily life would be a daily reminder of the church's priorities. The seasonal religious observances would impose their own rhythms on castle life, often at odds with practical needs. Lent would mean weeks of reduced food during the time when people were already weakened by winter privation. Easter would require elaborate celebrations when resources were stretched thin. Christmas would demand joy and generosity from people who had little reason for either. The control that religious authority exercised over intellectual life would be particularly stifling. Books were rare and heavily censored, with most learning taking place in religious institutions that filtered all knowledge through approved doctrines. The concept of secular education, of learning for its own sake, of questioning established truths, would be not just unavailable, but actively suppressed. The treatment of women within religious structures would be especially harsh, with female spirituality channeled into narrow roles that emphasize submission, silence, and self-denial. Women who showed too much religious fervor might be suspected of heresy, while those who showed too little might be accused of moral corruption. The idea of female religious leadership, of women interpreting scripture or leading spiritual communities, would be unthinkable. The medical beliefs that intertwined with religious doctrine would create additional suffering for those already dealing with primitive healthcare. Illness would be interpreted as divine punishment, making patients feel guilty for their pain. Treatments would be accompanied by prayers and rituals that might interfere with practical care. The concept of medicine as a purely secular science would be foreign to a world where spiritual and physical healing were inseparably linked. The social hierarchies that religious doctrine supported would make questioning inequality not just socially dangerous but spiritually perilous. The idea that some people were born to rule while others were born to serve would be presented as divine will, making resistance to oppression equivalent to rebellion against God. The concept of social justice, of equality before the law, of universal human rights, would be not just revolutionary, but blasphemous. The death that stalked medieval castle life would be given meaning through religious framework that emphasized suffering as purification and early death as potentially merciful. The high mortality rates, the constant threat of violence, the prevalence of disease would all be interpreted through doctrines that made earthly life seem like a brief, painful preparation for eternal judgment. The fear of hell that permeated medieval religious consciousness would create a level of existential anxiety that would be unbearable to modern minds. The detailed descriptions of eternal torment, the arbitrary nature of salvation, the constant possibility of unknowing sin would make every decision fraught with cosmic significance. The concept of a loving God who wanted human happiness would be overshadowed by images of divine wrath and eternal punishment. The confession system that required regular admission of sins to priests would eliminate any possibility of private spirituality or personal growth. Your most intimate thoughts, your deepest shames, your secret doubts would all be subject to clerical scrutiny and judgment. The idea of working through spiritual struggles privately, of finding your own path to meaning and peace, would be impossible in a system that demanded external validation of internal states. The religious festivals that punctuated the year would be elaborate community performances that required participation regardless of personal inclination. You'd be expected to sing, dance, pray, and celebrate on command, conforming to collective expressions of faith that might have nothing to do with your own spiritual needs or experiences. The pilgrimage system that promised spiritual rewards for physical suffering would create additional hardships for people already struggling with basic survival. The idea of traveling long distances in dangerous conditions, spending precious resources on religious journeys, abandoning work and family obligations for spiritual purposes, would impose burdens that many could not afford. The relic worship that formed a central part of medieval religious practice would create a marketplace of spiritual goods that exploited the faithful while enriching religious institutions. The belief in the miraculous power of saints' bones, clothing, and possessions would drive people to spend money they didn't have on objects of dubious authenticity and questionable spiritual value. The moral codes that religious authority imposed would be rigid and comprehensive, governing not just major life decisions but daily behaviors and thoughts. The concept of moral relativism, of situational ethics, of personal responsibility for determining right and wrong would be foreign to a system that provided detailed rules for every aspect of existence. The literacy requirements that religious participation demanded would exclude most people from direct engagement with spiritual texts, making them dependent on clerical interpretation and potentially manipulation. The idea of reading scripture for yourself, of forming your own understanding of religious teachings, of questioning official interpretations, would be impossible for those who couldn't read and dangerous for those who could. The gender segregation that religious practice enforced would limit human relationships and personal development in ways that would be particularly difficult for modern people to accept. The idea that men and women were fundamentally different creatures with separate roles and capabilities would be presented as divine truth rather than social convention. The temporal authority that religious institutions exercised would make them partners in political oppression rather than sources of spiritual comfort. The Church's role in supporting feudal hierarchies, in blessing warfare, in legitimizing inequality, would make it complicit in the very systems that made daily life so difficult for most castle dwellers. The intellectual constraints that religious orthodoxy imposed would stifle curiosity and creativity in ways that would be psychologically devastating to modern minds. The idea that certain questions couldn't be asked, that certain ideas couldn't be explored, that certain possibilities couldn't be imagined, would create a kind of mental prison that would be unbearable to people accustomed to intellectual freedom. The communal nature of religious practice would eliminate the possibility of private spiritual experience or personal religious development. Your faith would be subject to constant scrutiny and judgment by neighbors, priests, and religious authorities who had their own agendas and biases. The economic burden that religious obligations imposed would be particularly crushing for those already struggling with basic survival. The tithes, offerings, fees, and labor demands that religious institutions made would take resources away from families who desperately needed them for food, shelter, and clothing. The political dimensions of religious authority would make spiritual life inseparable from power structures that most people had no ability to influence or escape. The Church's role in supporting kings, legitimizing wars, and maintaining social hierarchies would make religious participation complicit in systems of oppression and violence. The seasonal rhythms that religious observance imposed would often conflict with practical needs and natural cycles, creating additional stress and hardship for people already struggling to survive. The demand for celebration during times of scarcity, for fasting during periods of hunger, for elaborate rituals during busy seasons would add artificial difficulties to lives that were already challenging enough. The death rituals that religious practice demanded would be elaborate and expensive, imposing financial burdens on families during their most vulnerable moments. The idea that proper burial and mourning required specific ceremonies, particular objects, and clerical involvement would make grief itself a commodity that had to be purchased. The salvation system that religious doctrine promised would be so complex and arbitrary that most people would live in constant uncertainty about their spiritual fate. The idea that salvation depended on factors beyond human control, that good works might not be enough, that divine grace was distributed according to mysterious criteria would create a level of existential anxiety that would be unbearable. The community surveillance that religious conformity required would eliminate any possibility of privacy or personal autonomy. Your neighbors would be expected to report signs of heresy, moral corruption, or spiritual deviation, making every relationship potentially dangerous and every conversation a potential source of accusation. The gendered expectations that religious teaching imposed would limit human potential and personal development in ways that would be particularly painful for modern people. The idea that women were inherently inferior, that men were naturally dominant, that gender roles were divinely ordained, would constrain human possibilities in ways that would be psychologically devastating. The moral absolutes that religious doctrine proclaimed would eliminate the possibility of ethical flexibility or situational judgment, making it impossible to adapt moral principles to changing circumstances or individual needs. The idea that certain actions were always wrong, regardless of context or consequence, would create moral dilemmas that had no satisfactory solutions. The afterlife beliefs that religious teaching promoted would make earthly life seem like a brief, painful preparation for eternal judgment, devaluing human experience and making suffering seem not just inevitable, but spiritually beneficial. The idea that true happiness could only be found after death would make present misery seem not just acceptable, but necessary. The religious authorities who mediated between God and humanity would be fallible human beings with their own agendas, biases, and limitations, making spiritual guidance unreliable and potentially harmful. The idea that salvation depended on the intervention of corrupt, ignorant, or self-serving priests would make religious life a source of anxiety rather than comfort. The ritual requirements that religious practice demanded would be elaborate and time-consuming, taking energy and resources away from practical tasks that were essential for survival. The idea that spiritual obligations took precedence over physical needs would create conflicts between religious duty and human welfare that would be impossible to resolve satisfactorily. The doctrinal complexities that religious teaching involved would be beyond the comprehension of most people, making faith itself a source of confusion and anxiety rather than clarity and peace. The idea that salvation depended on understanding theological concepts that were intentionally mysterious would make religious life intellectually and emotionally exhausting. The social control that religious institutions exercised would make them partners in maintaining systems of oppression rather than sources of liberation and hope. The Church's role in supporting feudal hierarchies, legitimizing inequality, and suppressing dissent would make religious participation complicit in the very systems that made life so difficult for most people. And yet, despite all these constraints and contradictions, medieval people found ways to create genuine spiritual meaning within the rigid framework of institutional religion. They developed personal devotions, formed meaningful relationships with saints and spiritual guides, and found comfort in rituals that connected them to something larger than themselves. But they did so while navigating a system that was as much about social control as spiritual guidance, as much about political power as divine grace. The religious life of a medieval castle would be both the source of whatever meaning and comfort people could find and one of the primary mechanisms of their oppression. It would provide structure in chaos, hope in despair, and community in isolation. But it would also impose constraints, create anxiety, and limit human potential in ways that would be unbearable to modern minds, accustomed to religious freedom and spiritual autonomy. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the freedom you have to believe what you choose, to question what doesn't make sense, to find spiritual meaning in your own way and in your own time. The ability to explore different religious traditions, to doubt without fear, to find God or meaning or purpose according to your own understanding, these are liberties that were unimaginable to those who lived and died within the stone walls of medieval castles. The marriage customs that governed medieval castle life would be profoundly alien to anyone accustomed to modern ideas about love, partnership, and personal choice. Marriage wasn't about romance or compatibility, or even basic affection. It was a business transaction, a political alliance, a way of consolidating property and power that treated human beings like particularly valuable livestock. If you were a woman in a medieval castle, your marriage would be arranged by your father or male guardian, often when you were still a child. You might meet your future husband for the first time on your wedding day, or perhaps never at all if he was fighting in distant wars or managing far-off properties. The concept of dating, of getting to know someone before committing your life to them, of choosing your own partner based on attraction or shared values, would be completely foreign to a world where marriage was about bloodlines and inheritance rather than love. The wedding ceremony itself would be a public display of wealth and political connections, rather than a celebration of two people choosing to spend their lives together. Every detail would be calculated for maximum social impact, from the guest list to the feast, to the elaborate clothing that probably cost more than most families would see in a lifetime. You'd stand through hours of religious ritual in uncomfortable formal wear, surrounded by people who were there to witness a contract rather than celebrate a romance. The consummation of marriage would be equally public and humiliating, with witnesses sometimes present to ensure the union was properly sealed. The concept of privacy, of intimate moments between partners, of building physical and emotional connection gradually over time, would be impossible in a world where even the most personal aspects of marriage were subject to public scrutiny and political consideration. Your role as a wife would be clearly defined and utterly limiting. You'd be expected to produce male heirs, manage household servants, and represent your husband's interests in his absence, but you'd have no legal rights, no financial independence, no ability to make decisions about your own life or your children's futures. The idea of marriage as a partnership between equals, of spouses supporting each other's individual growth and happiness, would be inconceivable in a system where women were essentially property transferred from father to husband. The domestic violence that was considered normal and even necessary in medieval marriages would be shocking to modern sensibilities. Husbands had not just the right, but the obligation to physically discipline their wives, and this violence was supported by law, custom, and religious teaching. The concept of domestic abuse as a crime, of women having the right to leave violent relationships, of marriage requiring mutual respect and consent, would be revolutionary ideas that wouldn't emerge for centuries. The reproductive expectations placed on women would be both physically and psychologically devastating. You'd be expected to bear children continuously throughout your fertile years, regardless of your health, your circumstances, or your own desires. Pregnancy and childbirth were incredibly dangerous, with mortality rates that would horrify modern medical professionals. Many women would die in childbirth, and those who survived would often be permanently damaged by repeated pregnancies and primitive medical care. The children produced by these marriages would belong entirely to their fathers, with mothers having no legal rights over their own offspring. If your husband died, his relatives might take your children away from you. If he divorced you for failing to produce male heirs, you'd lose all contact with the children you'd risked your life to bear. The concept of parental rights, of mothers having equal say in their children's upbringing, of families being built on love rather than legal obligation, would be unknown. The emotional toll of these arranged marriages would be particularly difficult for people accustomed to modern ideas about love and partnership. You might spend your entire life married to someone you disliked, feared, or barely knew. The concept of emotional intimacy, of sharing your thoughts and feelings with a partner who understood and supported you, would be a luxury available only to the very fortunate. Most marriages would be exercises in mutual tolerance at best, mutual suffering at worst. The sexual expectations within medieval marriage would be governed by religious doctrine rather than mutual desire or pleasure. Sex was primarily for reproduction, and any enjoyment of physical intimacy was considered potentially sinful. The concept of sexual compatibility, of partners exploring physical pleasure together, of intimacy as an expression of love rather than duty, would be foreign to a world where sexuality was heavily regulated by religious and social authorities. The economic dimensions of marriage would make every relationship a financial calculation rather than an emotional choice. Dowries, bride prices, inheritance rights, and property transfers would be more important than personal compatibility or mutual affection. The concept of marrying for love, of choosing a partner based on emotional connection rather than economic advantage, would be seen as foolish and irresponsible. The divorce laws that governed medieval marriage would make escape from unhappy unions virtually impossible, particularly for women. Marriages could only be dissolved under very specific circumstances, usually involving issues of consanguinity or non-consummation that were difficult to prove and politically dangerous to pursue. The concept of no-fault divorce, of being able to end a marriage simply because it wasn't working, would be unthinkable in a world where marriage was considered a sacred and permanent bond. The social pressure to marry would be overwhelming, with single adults viewed as incomplete, suspicious, or potentially dangerous. The concept of choosing to remain single, of finding fulfillment outside of marriage, of building a meaningful life without a spouse, would be almost impossible in a society where marriage defined social status and provided economic security. The age differences that were common in medieval marriages would be particularly disturbing to modern sensibilities. Young girls might be married to much older men, creating relationships that were inherently unequal and often exploitative. The concept of age-appropriate relationships, of waiting until both partners were mature enough to make informed decisions, would be irrelevant in a world where marriage was about political and economic advantage rather than personal readiness. The multiple marriages that were common due to high mortality rates would create complex family dynamics that would be emotionally exhausting. You might find yourself caring for stepchildren whose mothers had died, competing with the memories of previous spouses, or watching your own children form attachments to step-parents who might disappear if your spouse died and you remarried again. The courtly love traditions that developed in medieval literature would actually make real marriages more difficult by creating impossible romantic ideals that had nothing to do with the practical realities of medieval life. The concept of passionate, transcendent love was reserved for extramarital affairs and literary fantasies, making actual marriages seem even more mundane and disappointing by comparison. The family planning that was possible in medieval times would be limited to abstinence, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, and prayers for divine intervention. The concept of controlling fertility, of choosing when and how many children to have, of planning families based on resources and desires rather than chance, would be mostly impossible with the limited medical knowledge and social constraints of the time. The extended family obligations that marriage created would be overwhelming and inescapable. You'd be responsible not just for your spouse and children, but for aging parents, unmarried siblings, widowed relatives, and various hangers-on who depended on your household for survival. The concept of the nuclear family as an independent unit would be foreign to a world where extended kinship networks determined survival and social status. The widowhood that many women would eventually face would bring both liberation and vulnerability. As a widow, You might finally have some legal rights and personal autonomy, but you'd also be economically insecure and socially isolated. The pressure to remarry would be intense, but your options would be limited by age, resources, and the political considerations of your late husband's family. The religious dimensions of marriage would make every aspect of the relationship subject to clerical oversight and moral judgment. Priests would have opinions about how often you had sex, what positions were acceptable, whether you were fulfilling your marital duties properly. The concept of marriage as a private relationship between two consenting adults would be impossible in a world where the Church considered itself the ultimate authority on all matters of sexuality and family life. The legal frameworks that governed marriage would be complex, contradictory, and heavily biased toward male interests. Women would have virtually no rights within marriage, no ability to own property independently, no legal recourse against abusive husbands. The concept of marriage as a partnership with equal rights and responsibilities would be revolutionary in a world where wives were essentially owned by their husbands. The social expectations that surrounded marriage would be rigid and comprehensive, governing everything from how spouses addressed each other to how they appeared in public, to how they distributed their time and attention. The concept of defining your own relationship, of creating unique partnerships that reflected individual personalities and needs, would be impossible in a world where social conformity was essential for survival. The educational differences between spouses would often be enormous, with husbands receiving formal education while wives were kept deliberately ignorant. This intellectual inequality would make genuine partnership impossible and ensure that women remain dependent on male guidance for any decision requiring literacy or knowledge of the wider world. The emotional support systems that modern marriages provide would be largely absent from medieval relationships. The concept of spouses as best friends, as confidants who shared their deepest thoughts and feelings, as partners who supported each other through emotional challenges, would be foreign to relationships built on duty and obligation rather than affection and understanding. The leisure activities that modern couples enjoy together would be mostly unavailable to medieval spouses who would be too busy with survival tasks to develop shared interests or hobbies. The concept of spending quality time together, of building relationship through shared experiences and mutual enjoyment, would be a luxury that few could afford. The communication skills that healthy modern relationships require would never be developed in a world where emotional expression was discouraged and conflict resolution was based on authority rather than negotiation. The concept of working through disagreements through honest discussion, of compromising to meet both partners' needs, of growing together through open communication, would be impossible in relationships based on hierarchy and submission. The personal growth that modern people expect from marriage would be actively discouraged in a world where stability and conformity were more important than individual development. The concept of spouses helping each other become better people, of relationships that evolved and deepened over time, of partnerships that supported personal dreams and ambitions, would be foreign to marriages designed to maintain social order rather than promote human flourishing. The privacy that modern couples take for granted would be completely absent from medieval marriages, which were lived under constant observation by extended family, servants, and community members. The concept of having intimate conversations, private jokes, or secret moments together would be impossible in households where every interaction was subject to scrutiny and judgment. The equality that modern marriages strive for would be not just absent, but actively opposed in a world where gender hierarchy was considered natural and divinely ordained. The concept of marriage as a partnership between equals, of decisions made jointly, of power shared rather than concentrated in male hands, would be revolutionary ideas that challenged the very foundations of medieval society. And yet, despite all these constraints and limitations, some medieval couples did manage to find genuine affection and companionship within the rigid framework of arranged marriage. They created private worlds of mutual respect and care, developed deep emotional bonds over years of shared hardship, and found ways to express love within the narrow confines of social expectation. But they did so despite their circumstances rather than because of them, creating oases of human connection in a desert of social control. The marriage you might enter in a medieval castle would be less about love and more about survival, less about personal happiness and more about social obligation, less about individual choice and more about family strategy. It would provide economic security and social status, but at the cost of personal autonomy and emotional fulfillment. The concept of marriage as a source of joy, growth, and mutual support would be foreign to a world where relationships were primarily about power, property, and the production of legitimate heirs. As you consider your own relationships tonight, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the freedom you have to choose your own partners, to build relationships based on love and compatibility, to create partnerships that reflect your own values and desires, the ability to marry for love, to divorce if necessary, to maintain your individual identity within a relationship. These are liberties that would have been unimaginable to those who lived within the stone walls of medieval castles, where love was a luxury and marriage was just another form of feudal obligation. The educational opportunities available to you in a medieval castle would be so limited that they would barely qualify as education by modern standards. If you were fortunate enough to be born into nobility, you might receive some basic instruction in reading and writing, but even this would be heavily restricted and focus primarily on religious texts and basic record-keeping. The concept of a well-rounded education, of learning for the sake of knowledge, of exploring different subjects and ideas, would be completely foreign to a world where information was carefully controlled and intellectual curiosity was often viewed with suspicion. For most castle dwellers, formal education simply didn't exist. If you were a servant, a peasant, or anyone without noble blood, you would live your entire life without ever learning to read or write. The written word would be as mysterious to you as hieroglyphics, accessible only to a tiny elite who jealously guarded their literacy as a source of power and privilege. You would depend entirely on oral tradition for any knowledge beyond your immediate experience, limiting your understanding of the world to what you could see, hear, and directly touch. The few books that existed would be handwritten manuscripts, incredibly expensive and rare. A single book might cost more than a family's annual income, making personal libraries impossible for all but the wealthiest nobles. These manuscripts would be copied by monks in monasteries, often with errors creeping in through generations of transcription. The concept of mass-produced books, of having access to thousands of different texts, of being able to read whatever struck your fancy, would be pure fantasy in a world where books were precious objects that most people would never even see. The knowledge that was available would be heavily filtered through religious doctrine and classical authorities. Original thinking was discouraged, and new ideas were viewed with suspicion. The concept of scientific method, of testing theories through experimentation, of questioning established truths, would be not just unknown, but dangerous. You would be expected to accept the wisdom of ancient authorities without question, making intellectual progress nearly impossible. The teaching methods used would be based on rote memorization rather than understanding. Students, when they existed at all, would spend their time reciting lessons they had learned by heart without necessarily comprehending their meaning. The concept of critical thinking, of analyzing information and forming your own conclusions would be foreign to an educational system that valued conformity over creativity. The subjects taught would be limited and practical. Basic literacy might include learning to recognize important names and religious terms. Arithmetic would be limited to simple calculations needed for trade and accounting. Any advanced learning would be reserved for future clergy, who might study Latin, theology, and basic logic. The concept of liberal arts education, of studying literature, philosophy, science, and history for their own sake, would be unknown to most people. The gender discrimination in education would be particularly stark. Women, even noble women, would receive far less education than their male counterparts. They might learn basic household management and religious instruction, but they would be deliberately kept ignorant of subjects that might give them too much independence or authority. The concept of educational equality, of women having the same learning opportunities as men, would be revolutionary in a world where female intelligence was viewed as dangerous. The apprenticeship system that provided practical training would be harsh and often exploitative. Young people would be sent away from their families to learn trades, but they would spend years as unpaid laborers before gaining any real skills. The concept of structured learning programs, of gradual skill building with proper supervision, would be replaced by a sink or swim approach that left many apprentices abused and undertrained. The medical knowledge available would be a dangerous mixture of superstition, tradition, and occasionally accurate observation. Physicians, when they existed at all, would base their treatments on theories about bodily humours and astrological influences rather than scientific understanding. The concept of evidence-based medicine, of treatments tested for safety and effectiveness, would be unknown in a world where medical practice was more art than science. The legal education that existed would be limited to memorizing precedents and procedures rather than understanding principles of justice. The concept of law school, of systematic legal training, of lawyers who understood constitutional principles, would be foreign to a world where legal knowledge was passed down through tradition and personal connections rather than formal study. The historical knowledge available would be limited and often inaccurate. People would know little about their own past beyond local legends and religious stories. The concept of historical research, of studying primary sources and analysing evidence, would be unknown. Your understanding of the world would be limited to what had happened within living memory, making it impossible to learn from the mistakes and successes of previous generations. The geographical knowledge that people possessed would be incredibly limited. Most castle dwellers would know only their immediate surroundings, with the wider world remaining a complete mystery. Maps, when they existed at all, would be crude and often wildly inaccurate. The concept of global awareness, of understanding how different parts of the world connected and influenced each other, would be impossible in a world where travel was rare and communication was limited. The scientific understanding available would be based on ancient authorities rather than observation and experimentation. People would believe that the Earth was the center of the universe, that diseases were caused by bad air or divine punishment, that the weather was controlled by supernatural forces. The concept of natural laws, of cause and effect relationships that could be studied and understood, would be foreign to a world where everything was attributed to divine will or magical forces. The mathematical knowledge that existed would be basic and practical, limited to what was needed for trade and construction. Advanced mathematics, the kind that drives modern technology and scientific understanding, would be unknown. People would count with their fingers, make rough estimates, and rely on practical experience rather than precise calculations. The technological understanding available would be limited to traditional crafts and techniques that had been passed down through generations. Innovation was rare and often viewed with suspicion. The concept of research and development, of systematically working to improve existing technologies or create new ones, would be foreign to a world where change was feared and tradition was sacred. The linguistic knowledge that people possessed would be limited to their local dialect and perhaps a smattering of Latin for religious purposes. The concept of learning foreign languages for communication or cultural understanding would be unknown to most people. Even within the same region, different areas might speak dialects so different that communication was difficult. The artistic knowledge available would be limited to local traditions and religious themes. The concept of art history, of studying different artistic movements and techniques, would be unknown. Most people would never see great works of art, limiting their aesthetic education to whatever crude decorations existed in their immediate environment. The philosophical knowledge that existed would be heavily influenced by religious doctrine and ancient authorities. Original philosophical thinking would be discouraged or dangerous. The concept of ethics as a field of study, of systematic thinking about right and wrong, would be limited to religious instruction that discouraged questioning and independent thought. The political knowledge available would be limited to local power structures and traditional arrangements. The concept of political science, of studying different forms of government and their effectiveness, would be unknown. People would accept the political system they were born into without question, making political progress nearly impossible. The economic knowledge that existed would be based on traditional practices rather than systematic understanding. The concept of economics as a field of study, of understanding how markets work and how to promote prosperity, would be foreign to a world where economic relationships were based on tradition and personal obligation rather than rational analysis. The agricultural knowledge available would be based on tradition and superstition rather than scientific understanding. Farmers would follow practices passed down through generations without understanding why they worked or how they might be improved. The concept of agricultural science, of systematic efforts to improve crop yields and farming techniques, would be unknown. The military knowledge that existed would be based on experience and tradition rather than systematic study. The concept of military science, of analyzing tactics and strategy systematically, would be limited to a few exceptional commanders. Most military knowledge would be passed down through apprenticeship and practical experience. The social knowledge available would be limited to local customs and traditions. The concept of sociology, of studying how societies work and how they might be improved, would be unknown. People would accept social arrangements without question, making social progress nearly impossible. The psychological knowledge that existed would be based on religious and philosophical speculation rather than scientific observation. The concept of psychology as a field of study, of understanding how the mind works and how to promote mental health, would be foreign to a world where mental illness was attributed to supernatural causes. The communication skills that people developed would be limited by their lack of education and exposure to different ideas. The concept of rhetoric, of persuasive speaking and writing, would be limited to a tiny elite. Most people would struggle to express complex ideas or engage in sophisticated discussions. And yet, despite these enormous limitations, medieval people did manage to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. They created magnificent works of art and architecture, developed new technologies and techniques, and laid the groundwork for the intellectual achievements that would follow. But they did so despite their educational limitations rather than because of them, working within constraints that would be unimaginable to modern minds, accustomed to unlimited access to information and learning opportunities. The intellectual isolation that would surround you in a medieval castle would be profound and psychologically challenging. You would live in a world where curiosity was discouraged, where questions were dangerous, where the pursuit of knowledge was reserved for a tiny elite. The concept of lifelong learning, of continuing to grow and develop intellectually throughout your life, would be foreign to a world where most people's education ended in early childhood, if it began at all. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the educational opportunities that surround you, the ability to read whatever you choose, to learn about any subject that interests you, to question established truths and form your own opinions. These are freedoms that would have been unimaginable to those who lived within the stone walls of medieval castles. The books on your shelves, the schools in your community, the unlimited information available at your fingertips. These are not just conveniences, but miracles of human progress, paid for by generations who struggled in ignorance so that you might live in light. The very ability to fall asleep tonight while listening to historical information, to learn while you rest, to have access to knowledge from across the centuries. This represents a kind of educational luxury that medieval people could never have imagined. Rest well, knowing that you live in an age of unprecedented learning, where knowledge is no longer the exclusive privilege of the powerful, but the birthright of all who seek it. The sanitation systems that governed daily life in a medieval castle would assault every modern sensibility you possess about cleanliness, health, and basic human dignity. What we consider fundamental hygiene practices would be not just absent, but literally unthinkable to people who lived surrounded by waste, decay, and the constant threat of disease that thrived in conditions we'd now recognize as a public health catastrophe. Let's start with the most basic function: waste disposal. In your modern life, you flush a toilet and waste disappears, carried away by sophisticated sewage systems to treatment facilities you never see. In a medieval castle, human waste was collected in chamber pots and either dumped directly from windows into courtyards below or carried to primitive latrines built into the castle walls. These latrines were essentially stone seats, with holes that dropped waste directly into moats, rivers, or open pits, creating a constant source of contamination that poisoned water supplies and bred disease. The smell alone would be overwhelming. Medieval castles reeked of human and animal waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and the smoke from fires that burned constantly to provide heat and light. The rushes scattered on floors to provide cushioning would become repositories for spilled food, urine, vomit, and worse, changed so infrequently that they essentially became composting organic matter beneath your feet. Personal hygiene would be a concept so foreign to your daily experience that you'd struggle to maintain any sense of cleanliness. Bathing was rare, perhaps occurring only a few times per year, and when it did happen, it was a laborious process involving heating water over fires and filling wooden tubs that were shared among multiple family members. The same bath water might serve an entire household, with the most important person bathing first and servants using the increasingly filthy water last. Soap, as you know it, didn't exist. People might use harsh, lye-based substances that burned the skin, or more commonly, they'd simply rinse with water and hope for the best. The concept of daily washing, of feeling clean and fresh, of maintaining personal hygiene as a matter of health and comfort, would be utterly foreign to people who wore the same clothes for months and considered body odor a normal part of human existence. Dental care would be particularly horrifying. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no understanding of oral hygiene. People might chew on twigs or rub their teeth with rough cloth, but tooth decay was universal and painful. Most adults would have missing teeth, infected gums, and breath that would make modern people physically ill. Dental pain was simply endured until teeth fell out or people died from infections that spread from their mouths to their bloodstreams. The medical understanding of disease transmission would be so primitive that practices we'd now recognize as dangerously unsanitary were considered normal and even beneficial. Wounds would be treated with unwashed hands, using dirty instruments. The same tools might be used on multiple patients without any cleaning between uses. The concept of sterilization, of understanding how disease spreads through contamination, was centuries away from discovery. Food preparation and storage would operate under conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Meat would hang in open air until it began to rot, then be cooked and eaten anyway. Milk would sour quickly without refrigeration, but would still be consumed. Bread would become moldy and stale, but would be eaten after cutting away the worst bits. The concept of food safety, of understanding how bacteria and parasites spread through contaminated food, was unknown. Kitchen areas would be breeding grounds for disease and contamination. Cooking surfaces would never be properly cleaned. Utensils would be reused without washing. Food would be prepared by people with unwashed hands who might be carrying any number of infectious diseases. Cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods would be constant and unavoidable. Water sources would be contaminated with human and animal waste, making drinking water a constant health hazard. Wells would be located near latrines and refuse pits, allowing sewage to seep into drinking supplies. Rivers would serve simultaneously as sources of drinking water, waste disposal sites, and washing areas, creating a perfect system for spreading waterborne diseases. The clothing that people wore would become repositories for dirt, sweat, body oils, and parasites. Garments would be worn continuously for weeks or months without washing, accumulating layers of grime that would make them stiff and malodorous. The concept of clean clothes, of changing garments regularly, of maintaining clothing hygiene would be limited to the wealthy who could afford multiple sets of clothing and servants to wash them. Laundry, when it occurred at all, would be done in the same contaminated water sources used for drinking and cooking. Clothes would be beaten against rocks or scrubbed with harsh substances that damaged fabrics. There was no understanding of how to properly clean textiles or remove the bacteria and parasites that lived in unwashed clothing. The bedding where people slept would be infested with fleas, lice, bed bugs, and other parasites. Mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers would become homes for vermin and would never be properly cleaned or replaced. Sheets and blankets would be washed infrequently, if at all, becoming increasingly filthy over time. The concept of clean bedding, of sleeping in a sanitary environment, would be unknown to most castle dwellers. Hair care would be equally primitive and unhygienic. Most people would never wash their hair, allowing it to become matted with dirt, oils, and parasites. Lice would be constant companions, and the remedies used to combat them would often be more harmful than the infestations themselves. The concept of hair hygiene, of regular washing and grooming, would be foreign to people who considered head lice a normal part of life. The treatment of illness would actually spread disease rather than cure it. Physicians would move from patient to patient without washing their hands or cleaning their instruments. The same bloodletting tools would be used on multiple patients, spreading infections and diseases. Quarantine procedures were primitive and ineffective, allowing contagious diseases to spread rapidly through castle populations. Childbirth would occur under conditions that modern medical professionals would consider criminally negligent. Midwives would attend births with unwashed hands using unsterilized instruments. The mortality rates for both mothers and infants would be staggering, partly due to the unsanitary conditions surrounding delivery. The concept of sterile delivery environments, of medical hygiene during childbirth, was unknown. The disposal of dead bodies would create additional health hazards. In times of plague or war, corpses might accumulate faster than they could be properly buried, creating breeding grounds for disease and attracting scavengers. Even normal burials would often be shallow and inadequate, allowing decomposition to contaminate water supplies and spread illness. Animal husbandry practices would contribute to the unsanitary conditions. Livestock would live in close proximity to humans, often sharing the same living spaces. Animal waste would accumulate in courtyards and living areas, creating constant sources of contamination. The concept of separating human and animal living spaces for health reasons was unknown. The preservation of food would rely on methods that were often inadequate and sometimes dangerous. Salting, smoking, and drying were the primary preservation techniques, but they didn't always prevent spoilage or contamination. Food poisoning would be common, and the symptoms would often be attributed to supernatural causes rather than poor food handling. Pest control would be primitive and ineffective. Rats, mice, and insects would thrive in the unsanitary conditions, spreading disease and contaminating food supplies. The concept of systematic pest control, of understanding how vermin spread disease, was unknown. People would simply accept infestations as unavoidable aspects of daily life. The air quality within castles would be toxic by modern standards. Smoke from fires would fill enclosed spaces with carbon monoxide and other harmful gases. The combination of poor ventilation, burning materials, and accumulated waste would create atmospheric conditions that would damage lungs and respiratory systems over time. Wound care would be particularly dangerous. with injuries often becoming infected due to poor hygiene practices. The same bandages might be reused multiple times without cleaning. Wounds would be treated with substances that were more likely to cause infection than prevent it. The concept of antiseptic treatment, of keeping wounds clean and sterile, was unknown. The handling of infectious diseases would actually accelerate their spread rather than contain them. People with contagious illnesses would continue to interact with others, sharing living spaces, food, and personal items. The concept of isolation, of understanding how diseases spread through contact, was primitive and inconsistently applied. Mental illness would often be attributed to poor hygiene or moral corruption, rather than medical conditions, leading to treatments that made conditions worse rather than better. People suffering from psychological disorders would often be subjected to additional physical hardships that compounded their suffering. The seasonal variations in sanitation would make conditions even worse during certain times of year. Winter would bring additional challenges as waste would freeze and accumulate, creating massive sources of contamination when spring thaws arrived. Summer would intensify odors and accelerate decomposition, making unsanitary conditions even more unbearable. The social acceptance of these conditions would be perhaps the most shocking aspect to modern minds. People would consider terrible hygiene normal and unavoidable. The concept of cleanliness as a virtue, of sanitation as a responsibility, of hygiene as essential for health, would be foreign to people who had never experienced truly clean living conditions. And yet, despite these horrific sanitary conditions, people did survive and even thrive within the constraints of their time. They developed immune systems adapted to constant exposure to pathogens. They created social structures that helped communities endure epidemic diseases. They found ways to maintain dignity and humanity, even in conditions that would break modern spirits. But survival came at an enormous cost in terms of health, comfort, and lifespan. The diseases that thrived in unsanitary conditions would claim countless lives. The constant exposure to contamination would leave most people in perpetual states of minor illness. The psychological toll of living in such conditions would be enormous, though people had no alternative for comparison. As you settle into your clean bed tonight, surrounded by the miracle of modern sanitation, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the extraordinary hygiene that surrounds your daily life. The clean water that flows from your taps, the soap that removes dirt and bacteria, the sewage systems that carry waste safely away, the medical understanding that prevents disease transmission. These are not just conveniences, but victories won over centuries of human suffering. The ability to feel clean, to live in sanitary conditions, to trust that your environment won't make you sick. These are luxuries that would have been unimaginable to those who endured the filth and disease of medieval castle life. Rest well tonight, knowing that you live in the cleanest, safest, most hygienic period in human history, where sanitation is not a luxury, but a fundamental right that protects your health and dignity every single day. The medieval castle was indeed a place where survival was an accomplishment and comfort was a distant dream. Those who lived within its walls faced challenges that would overwhelm most modern people within hours. They endured cold that penetrated to their bones, hunger that never fully left them, disease that stalked them constantly, and social constraints that bound them as surely as physical chains. But in enduring these hardships, they also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. They found ways to create beauty in ugliness, meaning in suffering, and community in isolation. They built the foundations upon which our modern world rests, paying with their comfort and often their lives for the progress we now take for granted. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm, clean, safe environment, remember that you are living in a way that would have been beyond the wildest dreams of medieval castle dwellers. Every convenience you enjoy, every comfort you experience, every freedom you exercise represents centuries of human struggle and progress. You are not just surviving, you are thriving in ways that honor the memory of those who came before and endured so much so that you might know ease. Sleep well tonight, dear traveler, knowing that your existence is nothing short of miraculous when measured against the harsh realities of medieval castle life. The soft pillow beneath your head, the clean sheets that surround you, the gentle warmth that flows through invisible ducts to keep you comfortable. These simple blessings would have been unimaginable luxuries to those who once walked the cold stone corridors of fortress walls. As you close your eyes and let your breathing slow, perhaps spare a gentle thought for those long-ago souls who faced each dawn with courage, born of necessity rather than choice. They endured not because they were stronger than us, but because they had no alternative. They found joy in the smallest victories, a warm fire on a bitter night, a shared meal after hunger, the simple fact of waking to see another sunrise. Their world was one of limits, where every comfort was earned through suffering, where every pleasure was temporary, where survival itself was never guaranteed. Yet within those constraints, they built communities, raised children, created art, and kept alive the flame of human dignity that burns in us still. Tonight, as the modern world settles into its quiet rhythms around you, as traffic lights blink in empty streets and heating systems hum their gentle lullabies, remember that you carry within you the same spirit that sustained those medieval lives, the same capacity for endurance, for hope, for finding light in darkness. You wouldn't have survived in a medieval castle, not as you are now, shaped by comfort and ease, but you might have become someone who could, someone forged by hardship into a different kind of strength. The question isn't whether you could endure their world, but whether we can honor their memory by appreciating the extraordinary gift of our own. Rest now, in your warm sanctuary, knowing that somewhere in the turning of time, across the centuries that separate us from them, there is a connection, a thread of shared humanity that makes their struggles meaningful and our comforts precious. The castle walls have crumbled, the cold stones have fallen, but the human story continues. And tonight, you are its newest chapter. Sleep well and dream of morning lights streaming through windows that open to a world they could never have imagined, but one they helped to build with their quiet endurance and their refusal to surrender hope, even in the darkest of times.